The courthouse in Redemption Springs, Wyoming, was packed to the rafters on that sweltering summer day in 1885. Every bench creaked under the weight of bodies pressed together, all eyes fixed on the slender figure standing before the judge. Margaret Reed held her chin high, though her heart pounded like a wild mustang in her chest. At 26, she now faced the prospect of a noose rather than the future she'd dreamed of. Judge Walter Booker's gavel cracked against wood, silencing the murmurs. The court will now hear evidence in the matter of the territory of Wyoming versus Margaret Reed, he announced. Miss Reed stands accused of the murder of Joseph Hawkins, whose remains were discovered on Reed property last week. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, but she clasped them tightly before her. She could feel the hatred radiating from the Blackwell family seated in the front row. Augustus, with his silver beard and cold eyes, his sons Victor and Ezra flanking him like soldiers. Your Honor. The prosecutor began rising with a satisfied smile. We have new evidence that conclusively proves Miss Reed's guilt. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The body found on Reed land shows signs of having been moved recently. The prosecutor continued. However, beneath the current grave, we discovered older bloodstains consistent with the original murder having taken place in that very location on Reed property approximately 6 years ago. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. 6 years ago, her father had still been alive then. From the gallery, Augustus Blackwell's face remained impassive, but a slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. His sons bore identical expressions of righteous satisfaction. As the prosecutor continued, Margaret felt a presence beside her. Harrison Grayson, tall and solid as an oak, had moved closer to where she stood. His weathered face showed nothing but steady resolve. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I won't let them hurt you." Judge Booker's voice cut through her thoughts. Given the serious nature of these new findings, court will recess until tomorrow morning. The defendant will remain in custody. The gavel fell again with terrible finality. Margaret felt Sheriff Calhoun's hand on her arm, not rough but insistent, as he prepared to lead her back to her cell. This isn't over. Harrison promised, his blue eyes meeting hers with unwavering conviction. As Margaret was led away, she caught one last glimpse of Augustus Blackwell. The old man was watching her with the patient satisfaction of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere left to run. Her mind drifted back to how it had all begun just 2 weeks earlier, on a day that had started like any other, on the land she had fought so hard to keep. The merciless Wyoming sun beat down on Margaret as she knelt in the dirt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The taste of copper filled her mouth, and she spat blood onto the parched ground. Her white blouse, once crisp and clean, now hung in tatters from her shoulders streaked with dust and crimson. Victor Blackwell stood over her, his boots inches from her splayed fingers. His younger brother Ezra circled like a coyote, leaner and hungrier looking, with a meanness in his eyes that even Victor lacked. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Margaret," Victor said, his voice almost conversational. "Just sign the papers. Your father's been dead 6 months. You can't run this place alone." Margaret raised her head, meeting his gaze through the curtain of her auburn hair. "This land isn't for sale. Not to you. Not to anyone." Ezra laughed, the sound sharp as broken glass. "What's worth dying for? A few 100 acres of dirt and scrub. My father, your father is dead," Victor cut in. "And he left you with nothing but a worthless piece of land that you're too stubborn to let go of." Margaret struggled to her knees. Every movement sent splinters of pain through her ribs where Ezra's boots had connected. "This land was everything to my father. It's everything to me," Victor crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. For a moment, Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps. "Our father wants this land, Margaret. One way or another, he's going to have it." She gathered what little strength remained and spat at his feet. "Then he'll have to bury me on it first." The flicker in Victor's eyes died. He stood slowly brushing dust from his expensive trousers. "That can be arranged." Without warning, his hand shot out, striking her across the face with such force that she sprawled backward into the dirt. The world spun around her, the blue sky wheeling overhead. "Let's go, Victor," Ezra said, suddenly nervous. "She's had enough." Through swollen lips, she whispered, "Never." Victor nodded to Ezra, and the younger man moved forward, delivering a final vicious kick to Margaret's side that left her gasping. Then they mounted their horses, the animals' hooves kicking up dust that settled over Margaret's broken body like a shroud. "You've made your choice," Victor called over his shoulder. "No one's coming to save you, Margaret." Their laughter faded as they rode away, leaving Margaret alone beneath the vast, indifferent sky. The temptation to close her eyes, to surrender to the darkness hovering at the edges of her vision, was almost overwhelming. Instead, her fingers crept to the pocket of her torn skirt, seeking the familiar shape that had been her constant companion since her father's death. The silver pocket watch was still there, its surface cool against her bloodied fingertips. The hands had stopped at 3:17, the exact moment her father's heart had given out. Margaret pulled the watch out, clutching it tightly. "I promised you, Pa," she whispered to the empty air. "I promised I'd keep our land. They won't take it from me, not while there's breath in my body." With that promise echoing in her mind, Margaret Reed began the agonizing process of rising to her feet. Each movement was torture, but she forced herself upright through sheer force of will. Blood trickled down her chin. Her right eye was swelling shut. But she was standing. The Reed Ranch house was visible in the distance, a small weathered structure. 2 miles of open country stretched between Margaret and shelter water safety. She took one halting step, then another. The silver watch remained clutched in her palm, her father's spirit urging her forward when her body screamed for surrender. The sun tracked mercilessly across the sky as Margaret staggered across the open range land. Twice she fell to her knees, and twice she forced herself back up, the watch in her hand growing slick with her blood. She was perhaps halfway to the house when her strength finally failed her. Her legs buckled, and she sank to the ground, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. "I'm sorry, Pa," she murmured, her voice barely audible even to herself. The world around her began to fade, colors bleeding into one another. The last thing Margaret saw clearly was a cloud of dust on the horizon, a rider moving fast in her direction. Friend or foe, it no longer mattered. Her one coherent thought before consciousness fled was a small, bitter realization Victor had been wrong after all. Someone was coming. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against dry earth grew louder, pulling Margaret back from the edge of oblivion. Through her blurred vision, she made out the silhouette of a man on horseback, approaching at a gallop. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a full beard streaked with gray, and eyes the color of a winter sky, he moved with the cautious grace of a man accustomed to danger. "My God," he muttered as he knelt beside her. "What happened to you, miss?" Margaret tried to speak, but her parched throat produced only a raspy whisper. The stranger immediately reached for his canteen, gently lifting her head to help her drink. "Easy now," he cautioned. Small sips. After she had drunk enough to wet her throat, Margaret found her voice. "Who are you?" "Name's Harrison Grayson," he replied, his eyes moving methodically over her injuries. I have a spread about 10 miles north of here. His weathered face tightened with anger as he noted the pattern of her injuries. Who did this to you? Blackwell's. She managed the name itself, tasting bitter on her tongue. Something flickered in Harrison's eyes, recognition and a sudden, carefully controlled fury. Augustus Blackwell's boys. Margaret nodded weakly, wincing at the pain the small movement caused. Can you tell me your name? Harrison asked, his tone gentler now. Margaret Reed. His expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a momentary stillness. Jonathan Reed's daughter. The question sent a jolt through Margaret. You knew my father. Before Harrison could answer, Margaret gasped as a particularly sharp pain lanced through her side. She clutched at her ribs, feeling the tacky wetness of blood beneath her shredded blouse. Take the cloth off, she whispered, gesturing weakly to her side. Need to see. How bad? Harrison hesitated only briefly before nodding. With surprising delicacy for such large hands, he carefully lifted the torn fabric away from her side, revealing an ugly gash where Ezra's boot had connected with the metal buckle of her belt, tearing through cloth and skin alike. What Margaret saw in Harrison's face as he examined the wound was not embarrassment, but a controlled rage, and something else, a sadness that seemed deeper than the moment warranted. I've seen worse, he said quietly, though the tightness in his jaw suggested otherwise. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a clean bandana, which he folded into a pad and pressed gently against the bleeding gash. As he worked, Harrison began to recite in a low, steady voice. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters. Margaret's eye widened in surprise. Her father had often recited that same psalm during difficult times on the ranch. You really did know my father, she said, her voice stronger now. Harrison paused in his ministrations, meeting her gaze directly. I did. We served together in the war, Union Army 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. This revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her father had rarely spoken of his time in the war between the states, deflecting her questions with a pained smile and a change of subject. He never talked about the war, she said softly. Many of us don't, Harrison replied, his tone making it clear he counted himself among that number. He helped her sit up slowly. Can you ride? My place is closer than yours, and you need proper care for these wounds. Margaret nodded, then caught sight of something glinting in the dirt. My watch, she gasped, reaching for it. Harrison retrieved the silver timepiece, noting the stopped hands before gently placing it back in her palm. Your father's, yes. Margaret's fingers closed around the watch. The hands stopped when he died, 6 months ago. Harrison's expression softened with understanding. Without comment, he helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight, as they moved toward his horse. With careful strength, he lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. Why were you really on my land, Mr. Grayson? She asked, her voice barely audible over the rhythm of the horse's hooves. Behind her, Harrison was silent for so long that she thought he might not have heard her question. When he finally answered, his words were measured and careful. I made a promise once, he said, to look after those who needed looking after. Let's leave it at that for now. As they rode north, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains, Margaret felt the weight of unasked questions pressing against her chest. Harrison Grayson knew more than he was saying about her father, perhaps about the Blackwells, maybe even about why they wanted her land so desperately. But those questions would have to wait. For now, she focused on the steady rhythm of Harrison's heartbeat against her back, the strange sense of security she felt in the arms of a man who was still. despite his connection to her father, essentially a stranger. The silver watch remained clutched in her hand, its stopped hands a reminder of all she had lost. Yet for the first time since her father's death, Margaret felt the faintest stirring of something she had thought gone forever. Hope. The sun was setting by the time Harrison's ranch came into view, painting the western sky in bands of gold and crimson. Unlike the modest Reed homestead, the Grayson spread spoke of prosperity, a large two-story house with a wide porch, sturdy barn, and several outbuildings, all well-maintained, despite their obvious age. As they rode into the yard, the front door of the house opened, revealing an elderly black woman whose stern expression melted into concern at the sight of Margaret's battered form. "Lord have mercy!" she exclaimed, hurrying down the porch steps with surprising agility. "What happened, Harrison?" "Blackwell trouble, Ruby," Harrison said grimly as he dismounted. "This is Margaret Reed, Jonathan's daughter." Ruby's eyes widened at the name, the same flicker of recognition Margaret had seen in Harrison's face earlier. Jonathan Reed's girl. Those devils. She cut herself off. "Let's get her inside. I'll heat water and fetch my medicines." The interior of Harrison's home was as well kept as its exterior, simple but comfortable furnishings, polished wood floors and walls, adorned with a few carefully chosen paintings. Harrison carried Margaret to a small bedroom, laying her carefully on a bed covered with a handmade quilt. "Ruby's got a healing touch," he assured her. "Been patching me up for years." True to his word, Ruby appeared moments later with a basin of steaming water, clean cloths, and a worn leather case that proved to contain medicinal supplies. With efficient movements, she shooed Harrison from the room and set about cleaning Margaret's wounds. Ruby's hands were gentle but thorough, her dark eyes missing nothing as she worked. "Those Blackwell boys did this, she asked, her tone conversational despite the grim nature of her task. "Yes," Margaret admitted, wincing as Ruby cleaned the gash on her side. "They want my land. I refused to sell." Ruby made a sound somewhere between a snort and a laugh. "Course you did. You're Jonathan Reed's daughter, through and through." She applied a sweet-smelling salve to the wound. "Your daddy was a good man, one of the few." Margaret studied the older woman's face. "You knew him, too." "Knew of him," Ruby corrected, though something in her expression suggested there might be more to the story. "Word gets around about decent folk in these parts, especially those who treat everyone with the same respect." She began wrapping clean bandages around Margaret's ribs. "Harrison and your pa, they were cut from the same cloth." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Margaret once Ruby had left. Her mind whirled with questions about Harrison Grayson, about his connection to her father, and about the strange coincidence that had brought him to her rescue. Outside her door, she could hear the low murmur of voices, Harrison and Ruby, in quiet but intense conversation. Though she strained to make out their words, only fragments reached her. "Shouldn't have come back. Promised, Jonathan. Augustus will stop at nothing." The mention of Augustus Blackwell sent a chill through Margaret. What was the connection between the wealthy rancher's vendetta against her family and these people who had known her father? Unable to rest with so many questions unanswered, Margaret carefully eased herself from the bed. With cautious steps, she explored her surroundings. The hallway opened onto a comfortable sitting room lined with bookshelves, more books than she had ever seen outside the town library. Moving deeper into the house, she passed Harrison's study, the door slightly ajar. Inside, she glimpsed a large desk covered with papers, maps pinned to the walls, and a cabinet that stood partially open. Something about the cabinet drew her attention. Glancing over her shoulder, Margaret slipped into the study and approached the cabinet. Inside, she found surveying equipment, several rolled maps, and tools she didn't recognize. But it was the item at the back that captured her full attention, a framed daguerreotype showing two young soldiers in Union blue arms around each other's shoulders. With trembling fingers, Margaret lifted the frame. One of the young men was unmistakably Harrison, his beard then just a shadow. And beside him, looking happier than she could remember ever seeing him, was her father. "Finding what you're looking for?" Harrison's deep voice from the doorway made Margaret jump. She turned, clutching the frame, caught between embarrassment and determination. "Why didn't you tell me how close you and my father were?" Harrison entered the room slowly. "Would you have believed a stranger's claim to such friendship given your circumstances?" "I want to know everything," Margaret insisted. "About you, about how you knew my father, and about why the Blackwells want my land badly enough to beat me half to death for it." Harrison sighed, gesturing toward a pair of chairs by the unlit fireplace. "Sit before you fall down." Once they were seated, Harrison studied her face for a long moment. "Your father and I met in '62 at Antietam, bloodiest day of the war. After that kind of experience, you either become brothers or enemies. Your father saved my life twice before Appomattox." "And after the war," Margaret prompted when he fell silent. Harrison's gaze shifted to the middle distance. "We kept in touch. Letters, mostly. I came west in '68. He followed a few years later. We had some business dealings together." "What kind of business?" Margaret pressed, sensing evasion. Instead of answering directly, Harrison rose and crossed to a bookshelf. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled a leather-bound Bible from among the volumes and returned to his seat. Opening the book, he revealed hollowed-out pages containing several folded papers. "Your father was a station master," he said quietly, removing one of the papers and unfolding it to reveal a hand-drawn map. "Station master?" she repeated, confused. "For the Underground Railroad." Harrison's voice had dropped to just above a whisper. "Even after the war, even out here, there were those who needed safe passage. Former slaves fleeing continued persecution in the South, heading for Canada or freedom in Western territories." Margaret stared at him in stunned silence. This was a side of her father she had never known. "My father helped runaway slaves," she finally managed. "He did more than help them," came a new voice from the doorway. Ruby stood there, her lined face solemn in the lamplight. "He saved lives, mine included." Margaret looked from Ruby to Harrison and back again, pieces clicking into place. "You weren't always Harrison's housekeeper, were you?" Ruby entered the room, lowering herself into a third chair. "I was born in Mississippi, owned by a man named Carruthers. After the war, he refused to acknowledge our freedom. When my son Jackson tried to leave, Carruthers had him whipped, nearly killed him. We ran north, but Carruthers sent bounty hunters after us. In '73, Harrison continued, your father received word that a woman and her injured son needed shelter. That was Ruby and Jackson. They stayed at your ranch for nearly a month while the boy healed." "What happened to your son?" Margaret asked Ruby. The older woman's face tightened with old grief. "We were heading for the next station when the hunters found us. Jackson. He drew them off so I could escape. I never saw him again. Harrison found me wandering half dead in the foothills," Ruby continued. "Brought me here. I've been with him ever since, helping others when they come through." Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling the ache of her injuries amplified by these revelations. "And the Blackwells? Where do they fit into all this?" Harrison and Ruby exchanged a glance laden with unspoken communication. "Augustus Blackwell has been buying up land all through the territory," Harrison explained, "building an empire. But your father refused to sell no matter the price offered." "There's more to it than that," Margaret insisted. "This isn't just about land." "No," Harrison admitted. "It's not. But that's a story for another time. You need rest, Margaret." Though frustration burned within her, Margaret couldn't deny her exhaustion. Her wounds throbbed, and the emotional weight of all she'd learned pressed heavily upon her. With reluctance, she allowed Ruby to help her back to the bedroom. As Ruby adjusted the bed covers, Margaret asked, "Did my father leave a Bible like Harrison's, with things hidden inside?" Ruby's hands stilled momentarily. "He might have. Your father was a careful man. If he left something behind, he would have hidden it where only you would think to look." She patted Margaret's hand. "Sleep now, child. Dawn comes early, and healing takes strength." Left alone, Margaret stared at the ceiling, her father's silver watch on the bedside table. All her life she had believed she knew Jonathan Reed, his kindness, his quiet strength, his love for the land. Now she realized she had known only pieces of the man, and somewhere on her ranch there might be a hiding place containing the answers to questions she hadn't known to ask until today. With that thought circling in her mind, Margaret finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with running figures, shadowy pursuers, and her father standing on a distant hill gesturing urgently toward something she couldn't quite see. Morning arrived with the gentle sounds of Ruby moving about the kitchen and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. Margaret awoke slowly, each breath a reminder of yesterday's brutality, as her ribs protested even the slightest movement. With careful movements, she managed to dress herself in clothes Ruby had left for her, a simple blouse and skirt that must have belonged to a woman smaller than Ruby herself. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Harrison seated at the kitchen table, a steaming mug before him and an open Bible at his elbow. "Good morning," he greeted her, rising from his seat. "Ruby said you'd be needing this." He gestured to a cup of coffee waiting at an empty place setting. "Thank you." Margaret eased herself carefully into the chair. "Pain bad?" he asked simply. "I've had worse," she lied, taking a sip of the strong black coffee. Harrison made a sound that might have been amusement or disbelief, but didn't challenge her statement. Instead, he turned his attention back to the Bible before him, one weathered finger tracing along the lines of text. "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," he read aloud. Your father was fond of that verse. "You never married?" she asked, surprising herself with the personal question. A shadow passed over Harrison's face. "I did once, Hannah, and we had a son, Joseph." He closed the Bible gently. "They died in the spring of '77. Flash flood took them while I was in town getting supplies." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, recognizing the weight of loss they shared. Harrison nodded once. "Your father wrote to me afterward, said sometimes God takes away, but he also gives us purpose if we're willing to see it." His gaze grew distant. "Your father understood loss. He never got over your mother's passing." "I was 12 when she died," Margaret said softly. "Influenza. Pa never even looked at another woman after that. Said Mom was his one and only." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the sounds of Ruby working in the garden outside, singing an old spiritual. "What will you do now?" Harrison finally asked. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Go back to my ranch. The Blackwells may have thought they taught me a lesson, but all they did was show me what they're willing to do." "That's a dangerous choice," Harrison warned. "Augustus Blackwell doesn't take defeat lightly." "I won't be driven off my land," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm despite her fear. "That ranch is all I have left of my father." Before Margaret could continue, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Harrison rose swiftly, moving to the window with practiced caution. "Sheriff Calhoun," he reported, his tone neutral. Margaret tensed. Nathaniel Calhoun had been sheriff of Redemption Springs for as long as she could remember, a former Confederate officer with a reputation for keeping the peace, if not always for impartial justice. Harrison moved to the door, opening it as the sheriff dismounted. Nathaniel Calhoun was a tall, lean man in his mid-50s, his once dark hair and mustache now streaked with gray. "Harrison," he greeted with a nod. "Heard you might have a guest." His gaze shifted to Margaret, standing now in the doorway. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her injuries. "Miss Reed, you're looking a mite worse for wear." "Sheriff," Margaret acknowledged, lifting her chin. "Have you come to arrest those who did this to me?" Calhoun removed his hat, turning it absently in his hands. "That depends on your story, I reckon. Mind if I come in?" Once they were seated around the kitchen table, the sheriff began, "Why don't you tell me what happened?" "Miss Reed," Margaret recounted the events with as much detail as she could provide, the Blackwells' arrival at her property, their demands that she sell, and the violence that followed her refusal. Throughout her account, the sheriff's expression remained carefully neutral, though she thought she detected a flicker of genuine concern. When she finished, Calhoun set down his cup with deliberate care. "That's a serious accusation against the Blackwells. Victor and Ezra come from one of the most respected families in the territory." "Are you saying you don't believe me?" Margaret demanded, anger flaring. "I'm saying," Calhoun replied evenly, "that these things are rarely simple, especially when it comes to land disputes." Harrison leaned forward. "This wasn't a dispute, Nathaniel. It was an assault. The girl could have died out there." Calhoun sighed. "I'm well aware of that. I'm also aware that going after the Blackwells isn't like arresting some drunken cowpoke. Augustus Blackwell practically owns this territory." "So you'll do nothing?" Margaret asked bitterly. "I didn't say that. I'll talk to Victor and Ezra, get their side." He turned back to Margaret, his expression softening slightly. "I'm truly sorry about what happened to you, but you should know Augustus has been spreading stories in town." "What kind of stories?" Margaret asked, a chill running through her. Calhoun hesitated. "About your father, saying he wasn't the man everyone thought he was, that he had secrets, dark ones." The implication hung heavy in the air. Margaret's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "My father was a good man," she said firmly. "Whatever Augustus Blackwell is saying, it's a lie." Calhoun nodded. "Just thought you should know what you're up against." He rose, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll do what I can, Miss Reed. But my advice, be careful. The Blackwells don't like to lose." When Harrison returned from seeing the sheriff out, his expression was grim. "He's afraid," Margaret observed. "The sheriff is afraid of Augustus Blackwell." "With good reason," Harrison replied. "Nathaniel's daughter Emma works as Augustus's personal secretary. If Calhoun crosses the Blackwells too openly, she loses her position." "The stories Blackwell is spreading about my father, are they about the Underground Railroad?" Margaret asked. Harrison shook his head. "No, Augustus doesn't know about that part of Jonathan's life. This is something else." He hesitated. "Augustus is claiming your father was involved in a man's disappearance 6 years ago. A man named Joseph Hawkins." Margaret frowned. "I don't recall anyone by that name." "You wouldn't," Harrison said carefully. "He wasn't from around here. And if what Augustus is implying is true, your father would have had reason to keep his existence quiet." "What exactly is he implying?" Margaret demanded. Harrison met her gaze directly. "That your father killed Hawkins and buried him somewhere on your land, And that's why he refused to sell to Augustus all those years, because the body was there. Margaret felt as though all the air had been sucked from the room. The accusation was so outrageous, so contrary to everything she knew about her father, that she could scarcely process it. "That's absurd," she finally managed. "My father never killed anyone outside of the war." Harrison's expression remained troubled. "I know that. But Augustus is laying groundwork, Margaret. He wants your land, and he's willing to destroy your father's reputation to get it." "Why?" Margaret asked, frustration edging her voice. "What's so special about our ranch?" For a long moment, Harrison was silent. Finally, he sighed. "I think it's time you and I took a ride. There's something on your property. You need to see something I doubt you know is there." "What are you talking about?" "It's better if I show you," Harrison said, rising. "Can you ride your injuries?" "I can ride," Margaret interrupted, determination hardening within her. Whatever secrets lay buried on her land, she needed to know them, for her father's sake and for her own. "When do we leave?" "As soon as Ruby packs us some provisions," Harrison answered, his expression resolute. "We'll need to be careful. If the Blackwells are watching your property—" Margaret nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. "I'm not afraid," she stated, though they both knew it for the brave lie it was. Outside, she could hear Harrison speaking with Ruby, their voices low and urgent. Margaret reached into her pocket, fingers closing around her father's silver watch. The hands remained frozen at 3:17, marking the moment when time had stopped for Jonathan Reed. But time hadn't stopped for his daughter, and now it seemed she would need every minute remaining to her to uncover the truth and defend not only her land, but her father's legacy. They left Harrison's property as the sun climbed toward its midday height, taking a winding route through the foothills to avoid being spotted. Margaret rode her own mount, now a gentle sorrel mare Ruby had insisted was smooth as silk and twice as smart. Even so, each hoofbeat sent jolts of pain through Margaret's bruised body, though she kept her discomfort hidden behind tightly pressed lips. Harrison rode slightly ahead, his broad shoulders tense with vigilance. Several times he paused atop a rise, scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of a man who had survived both war and wilderness. "Are you expecting the Blackwells?" Margaret finally asked, as they paused in the shade of a cottonwood grove. Harrison's gaze remained fixed on the distant landscape. "I'm expecting trouble," he replied. "Augustus isn't a man who leaves things to chance. If Victor and Ezra fail to convince you to sell, he'll have another plan ready." A chill ran through Margaret despite the August heat. "You speak as if you know him well." "Know thy enemy," Harrison quoted grimly. "Your father and I both learned that lesson the hard way." He fell silent again, offering no further explanation as they resumed their journey. The land rose and fell around them, a sea of golden grass and sage punctuated by islands of pine and aspen. To the west, the distant peaks of the Wind River Range stood like sentinels against the endless blue sky. By mid-afternoon, they approached the Reed Ranch from the north, a direction that offered cover almost to the edge of the property. Harrison reined in beneath the shadow of a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the ranch house and outbuildings below. "No sign of anyone," he observed, though his posture remained alert. "But that doesn't mean they haven't been here." Margaret studied her childhood home with fresh eyes. The small ranch house, with its weathered clapboards and sagging porch, had always seemed enough a simple but dignified shelter that had withstood decades of Wyoming winters. Now, seeing it from a distance, she was struck by its vulnerability, its isolation in the vast landscape. "What are we looking for?" she asked, her voice low, despite the distance that separated them from potential eavesdroppers. Harrison's weathered face was grave. Something your father wanted, kept hidden. Something valuable enough that Augustus Blackwell would destroy a family's reputation to possess it. He gestured toward a line of cottonwoods that marked the course of a seasonal creek at the eastern boundary of the Reed property. We'll approach from there. Stay close. They left their horses secured in a stand of junipers and continued on foot, moving with the cautious silence of deer through the golden grass. Despite her injuries, Margaret matched Harrison's steady pace, driven by a determination that transcended physical pain. When they reached the ranch house, Harrison paused at the corner, his hand raised in a signal for Margaret to wait. For long minutes he stood motionless, listening for any sound that might betray another presence. Finally he nodded, and they slipped inside through the kitchen door. The interior was exactly as Margaret had left it, dishes stacked beside the dry sink, her sewing basket still on the chair by the window. Yet something felt different, as if invisible eyes had swept through the space in her absence. "Someone's been here," Harrison confirmed in a whisper, pointing to barely perceptible scuff marks on the plank floor marks that hadn't been there when Margaret left. "Searching for something," she whispered back, her heart pounding. "The journal," Harrison shook his head. "They wouldn't know about that. Your father was too careful." He moved toward the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. "Help me look for anything unusual, any place your father might have hidden something important." For the next hour they searched methodically through the small house, checking beneath floorboards, inside hollow chair legs, behind loose stones in the fireplace. They found nothing but dust and the occasional spider disturbed from its quiet existence. Frustration etched lines into Margaret's face as she sank onto her father's old rocking chair. "I don't understand. If there's something valuable here, why can't we find it?" Harrison stood by the window, his silhouette rimmed with afternoon light. "Because we're thinking like treasure hunters, not like Jonathan Reed." He turned to face her. "Your father wasn't a man who valued gold or silver. What meant most to him was family, legacy." Margaret's fingers tightened on the armrests of the rocker, the same chair where her father had spent countless evenings reading aloud to her as a child, teaching her letters and numbers, telling her stories of faraway places and times. "The chair," she said suddenly, a memory surfacing from years past. She stood quickly, ignoring the protest of her injuries. "Help me turn it over." Harrison raised an eyebrow, but complied carefully, flipping the rocking chair onto its back. The underside appeared normal at first glance, just the expected webbing of support straps crossing beneath the seat. But when Margaret's fingers pressed a specific point, where the right rear leg joined the frame, a small section of the wooden structure slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment. "Your father was a clever man," Harrison said with quiet admiration, as Margaret withdrew a leather-bound journal from the space. This is my father's handwriting." She confirmed, her voice hushed with reverence as she flipped through the pages. Unlike the journal they'd found in the cabin, which documented the Underground Railroad activities, this one was more personal, her father's private thoughts and concerns during the final years of his life. She turned to the entries from 1879, scanning quickly, until she found what she was seeking, a detailed account of a woman named Catherine Blackwell Hawkins, who had arrived at the ranch near midnight, brutally beaten by her husband. KBH. Margaret breathed, recalling the initials from the letter they'd found earlier. Catherine Blackwell Hawkins, Augustus's sister. Harrison nodded, his expression grave. "Keep reading." Margaret turned the pages with trembling fingers, absorbing her father's account of Catherine's slow recovery. The increasingly violent searches conducted by her husband, Joseph Hawkins, and Augustus Blackwell's threats against Jonathan Reed for interfering in a private family matter. Then she reached the entry dated June 3, 1879, and her breath caught. J.H. found us tonight, came armed and wild with drink and rage, demanded to see Kay, threatening to burn the ranch if I refused. When I told him she was beyond his reach, he fired at me, missed, thank the Lord. Then, in a moment, I shall never forget, turned the gun upon himself. The sound still echoes in my ears as I write these words. I have buried him in the north field beneath the old oak. May God have mercy on his troubled soul. Tomorrow I must decide what to tell Augustus, the truth he will never accept, or a lie he might believe. Margaret looked up from the journal, meeting Harrison's steady gaze. My father didn't kill him, didn't kill. It was suicide, just as you said. I never doubted Jonathan's word, Harrison said quietly. But Augustus will claim the journal is a fabrication, a convenient story written after the fact to cover a murder. Then we need to find the body. Margaret decided, her voice steadier than she felt. Prove it was suicide, not murder. Harrison shook his head. After 6 years, even if we could exhume the remains, determining cause of death would be nearly impossible. But the gun would still be there, Margaret insisted, a new determination filling her voice. If Hawkins shot himself, the gun would be with the body. That's not something my father would have overlooked. A noise from outside froze them both in place, the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats. Harrison moved swiftly to the window, keeping to one side of the frame as he peered out. Blackwell's, he reported grimly. Victor and Ezra. 2 horses coming up the main road. Margaret clutched the journal to her chest. What do we do? Harrison considered for only a moment. Stand your ground. This is your property. They're the trespassers. His eyes met hers, gauging her resolve. Are you ready for this? Despite the fear that fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird, Margaret nodded. I won't run from them, not anymore. Good girl, Harrison said softly, and in his tone she heard an echo of her father's quiet pride. They waited as the hoofbeats drew closer, stopping in the yard outside. Bootsteps crossed the porch, followed by a sharp knock on the door. Miss Reed, Victor Blackwell's voice carried clearly through the thin wood. I know you're in there. We saw 2 horses back in the junipers. Margaret exchanged a glance with Harrison, who nodded encouragement. Drawing a deep breath, she moved to the door and opened it, facing her attackers, with her head held high despite the visible evidence of their previous encounter still marking her face. Victor's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her bruises, though he quickly masked his reaction. Beside him, Ezra lounged against the porch railing, a malicious smile playing at his lips. Afternoon, Miss Reed, Victor greeted her, his tone almost conversational. Seems you're harder to discourage than we thought. Harrison stepped into view behind Margaret, his presence solid and reassuring. This is private property, Victor. You and Ezra need to leave. Victor's gaze shifted to Harrison, his smile cooling. Funny thing about property ownership can be such a fluid concept, especially when the current occupant is facing charges of harboring a murderer's secrets. His attention returned to Margaret, focusing on the journal she still held. What have you got there? More of Jonathan Reed's lies. My father wasn't a murderer, Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. And this journal proves it. Ezra laughed, the sound sharp as a knife's edge. A convenient story written by a desperate man. Nobody's going to believe that over the word of Augustus Blackwell. What do you want, Victor? Harrison demanded. Same thing we've always wanted, Victor replied with a shrug. The land. Though I must admit, finding out what really happened to our Uncle Joseph has become something of a family crusade over the years. Margaret studied Victor's face, seeing something beneath the arrogant facade, a flicker of genuine conviction. "You actually believe my father killed your uncle," she realized aloud. "I know he did," Victor stated flatly. "My father saw your father arguing with Uncle Joseph the day he disappeared. Reed was the last person to see him alive." "Because Joseph Hawkins came here looking for his wife," Margaret countered. "The wife he had beaten nearly to death. My father helped her escape, yes, but he didn't kill anyone." A shadow of doubt crossed Victor's face, quickly masked. "A convenient story." "The truth," Margaret insisted. "And I can prove it." Harrison shot her a warning glance, but Margaret pressed on determination overriding caution. "The body is buried in the north field under the old oak. If Hawkins killed himself, the gun will be there with him. Let me show you." Ezra's expression sharpened with interest, but Victor hesitated clearly, thrown by Margaret's confidence. "Why would you offer that?" "Because unlike your father," Margaret said, meeting his gaze directly, "I want the truth, not just a convenient story. My father wasn't a murderer, Victor. He was a good man who helped those in need, including your Aunt Catherine." At the mention of his aunt's name, something shifted in Victor's expression, a crack in the certainty that had driven his actions. "Catherine abandoned her husband," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Catherine fled for her life," Margaret corrected gently. "Ask her yourself if you don't believe me. She's alive and well in Boston, according to my father's journal." A tense silence filled the air, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark. The moment stretched balanced on a knife's edge, between violence and possibility. Finally, Victor lowered his gaze. "Show me," he said, his voice roughened by emotions Margaret couldn't fully decipher. "Show me where he's buried." The north field lay a quarter-mile from the house, separated from the main pasture by a low stone wall Jonathan Reed had built in more prosperous times. The oak tree stood alone in the center of the field, its massive branches providing the only shade for hundreds of yards in any direction. As they approached, Margaret felt a strange sense of reverence, knowing her father had stood in this same spot 6 years ago. Troubled soul, burdened by a death he hadn't caused but had been unable to prevent. Had he prayed as he dug the grave? Had he wondered as he worked alone under cover of darkness what consequences might someday follow from his merciful decision to bury a man who had caused so much pain? "Here," she said, stopping beneath the oak's spreading canopy. "According to my father's journal, Joseph Hawkins is buried here." Victor surveyed the area skeptically. "There's no marker, nothing to indicate a grave." "Your father wouldn't have marked it," Harrison explained. "Too many questions if someone had stumbled upon it." Ezra kicked at the ground impatiently. "Well, are we going to dig or just stand around telling stories all day?" Victor hesitated, then nodded grimly. "There are shovels in the barn. Go fetch them, Ezra." As his brother stalked off toward the distant outbuildings, Victor turned to Margaret, his expression troubled. "If you're wrong about this, if there's no body, or if the evidence shows your father killed our uncle—" "I'm not wrong," Margaret repeated, though a tremor of doubt had begun to seep into her conviction. What if her father's journal wasn't entirely truthful? What if, in his desire to protect her from the full truth, he had altered some details of that fateful night? Harrison, sensing her uncertainty, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Jonathan Reed was many things," he said quietly, "but never a liar. If he wrote that Hawkins took his own life, then that's what happened." Victor's gaze shifted between them, assessment in his eyes. "You seem awfully certain for a man who claims he wasn't there that night." "I knew your father better than anyone," Harrison replied simply. There wasn't a violent bone in his body. Before Victor could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Approaching from the direction of town came three riders. Sheriff Calhoun, flanked by two deputies, Margaret recognized from previous visits to Redemption Springs. "Now what?" Victor muttered, his hand tightening reflexively on his rifle. The sheriff reined in his horse several yards away, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. Margaret and Harrison, standing beneath the oak, Victor Blackwell with his rifle, and Ezra now returning from the barn with shovels slung over his shoulder. "Afternoon, folks," Calhoun greeted them, his tone neutral, but his posture alert. "Interesting gathering you've got here." "Sheriff," Victor acknowledged stiffly, "this is private business." Calhoun dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. "When that business involves an assault victim," he nodded toward Margaret, "and the sons of the most powerful man in the territory, it becomes my business." "We're resolving a misunderstanding," Margaret explained, stepping forward, "about what happened to Joseph Hawkins 6 years ago." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Hawkins Augustus's brother-in-law who disappeared." His gaze shifted to the ground beneath the oak. "Don't tell me he's buried here." "According to my father's journal, yes," Margaret confirmed, holding up the leather-bound book. "He recorded everything that happened that night, how Hawkins came looking for Catherine, threatened my father, and then took his own life when he realized his wife was beyond his reach." "That's quite a story," Calhoun observed, his tone noncommittal. "Augustus has been telling a different version for years." "We're about to discover which version is true," Victor said, gesturing to the shovels Ezra had brought. "Miss Reed has graciously offered to show us where Uncle Joseph is buried." The sheriff studied each of them in turn, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he sighed. "Well, if there's digging to be done, might as well have proper witnesses." He turned to his deputies. "Jenkins Lowry, give them a hand. I want everything done by the book." For the next hour, the men took turns excavating the area beneath the oak, the August sun beating down mercilessly despite the tree's shade. Margaret watched anxiously, the journal clutched to her chest like a talisman as layer after layer of soil was removed without any sign of human remains. "There's nothing here," Ezra declared at last, throwing down his shovel in disgust. "Another Reed lie." Margaret felt a crushing weight of doubt press upon her. Had her father's journal been a fabrication after all, a story constructed to protect her from a darker truth? "Wait," Harrison called from the edge of the pit they'd created. "There's something here." All eyes turned to where he pointed, a patch of soil darker than the surrounding earth, roughly the size and shape of a man. As they watched, Harrison's careful excavation revealed the unmistakable outline of human remains, bones still held in rough formation by the remnants of clothing that had somehow survived 6 years in the ground. "Sweet Jesus," one of the deputies muttered, crossing himself. Sheriff Calhoun moved closer, professional interest overriding any personal discomfort. "Careful now. We need to document everything exactly as it's found." With painstaking care, Harrison continued to clear away soil from around the skeleton. The remains were largely intact, though time and the elements had taken their toll. The clothing, once a fine suit, judging by the brass buttons and fragments of wool, had partially protected the bones from complete deterioration. "There," Harrison said, suddenly pointing to something gleaming dully among the remains. "By the right hand." Calhoun crouched at the edge of the grave, squinting against the sun. "It's a revolver. Smith & Wesson, looks like." A murmur ran through the assembled men. Victor pushed forward, his face pale beneath his tan. "Let me see." The sheriff carefully brushed away more soil, revealing the gun's position clutched in what had once been the dead man's right hand, the barrel angled toward what remained of the skull. "Suicide," Calhoun stated flatly, rising to his feet with a grunt, consistent with the position of the weapon, unless someone staged it very carefully. "My father wouldn't have staged anything," Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the trembling that had overtaken her limbs. "He wrote exactly what happened." Victor stared down at the remains of his uncle, complex emotions playing across his features. "All these years," he murmured, "Father said Jonathan Reed murdered Uncle Joseph in cold blood. Said he'd seen them arguing that day, that Reed had threatened him." "Your father saw what he wanted to see," Harrison suggested gently. "Grief can distort memory, twist facts to fit what the heart needs to believe." The sound of approaching riders interrupted any response Victor might have made. From the direction of town came a larger party, 5 men on horseback led by none other than Augustus Blackwell himself. Even at 65, Augustus cut an imposing figure. Tall and straight-backed, his silver beard neatly trimmed his clothing, immaculate despite the dust of the trail. His cold blue eyes, so like his son's, took in the scene with laser focus, the open grave, the gathered men, his sons, standing apart from the others. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, as he reined in his horse, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. Sheriff Calhoun stepped forward, placing himself between Augustus and the grave. "Official investigation, Augustus. Seems we've found Joseph Hawkins after all these years." A ripple of emotions crossed Augustus's face too quickly to interpret shock, disbelief, perhaps even fear. "That's impossible. Hawkins disappeared. Reed killed him and disposed of the body." "The body's here all right," Calhoun replied evenly. "And from all appearances, Hawkins took his own life. Guns still in his hand, aimed at his head." Augustus dismounted with surprising agility for a man his age striding toward the grave with purpose. "Let me see this supposed evidence." The gathered men parted to allow him passage, an instinctive deference to his authority that spoke volumes about his position in the territory. Only Harrison remained unmoved, his stance subtly protective, as Augustus approached the excavation. For a long moment, the older man stared down at the remains of his brother-in-law, his face an unreadable mask. Then his gaze lifted to Margaret, cold fury replacing the initial shock in his eyes. "This proves nothing," he declared. "Reed could have placed the gun in his hand after shooting him. A murderer's deception, nothing more." "That's not what the evidence suggests," Sheriff Calhoun countered carefully. "The position of the body, the gun, it's consistent with suicide, Augustus." Augustus turned on the lawman with barely contained rage. "And you're suddenly an expert on death investigations, Nathaniel." A failed Confederate officer turned small-town sheriff. Calhoun's weathered face flushed at the public insult, but his voice remained steady. "I've seen enough death to know the difference between murder and suicide. And unless you've got proof otherwise, this case is closed." "It's far from closed," Augustus snarled. "I want the territorial marshal brought in. A proper investigation, not this farce." He gestured contemptuously at the assembled men. Margaret stepped forward, still clutching her father's journal. "My father recorded everything that happened that night, Mr. Blackwell. How your brother-in-law came here looking for Catherine after she fled his abuse. How he threatened to burn our ranch when he learned she was beyond his reach. How he turned his own gun on himself in despair." Augustus's cold gaze swept over Margaret, his contempt palpable. "More lies from the Reed family. Your father was a murderer, girl, whatever pretty stories he may have written to salve his conscience." "Catherine would tell a different story," Harrison interjected quietly. The words struck Augustus like a physical blow. He turned slowly to face Harrison, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Grayson, I might have known you'd be involved in this." His lip curled in disdain. still fighting the war that ended 20 years ago. This has nothing to do with the war, Harrison replied evenly. It's about truth, about justice for Jonathan Reed's name, and about your sister's right to live free from a man who nearly beat her to death. A tense silence fell over the gathering, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the oak's leaves. Even Ezra, usually quick with a malicious remark, seemed subdued by the gravity of the moment. Victor stepped forward, positioning himself between his father and the others. I think we should all take some time to consider what we've found here, he said, his tone conciliatory but firm. The evidence suggests Uncle Joseph took his own life, Father. Perhaps it's time to let this old grudge rest. Augustus stared at his eldest son, disbelief etched in every line of his face. You're taking their side against your own family. I'm not taking sides, Victor replied steadily. I'm acknowledging facts. We've spent 6 years believing Jonathan Reed murdered Uncle Joseph, but what we've found today suggests otherwise. Coward, Augustus spat. Your grandfather would turn in his grave to see his namesake bend so easily. He turned back to Margaret, hatred burning in his eyes. This isn't over, girl. The Reed land will be mine, one way or another. With that final threat hanging in the air, Augustus Blackwell mounted his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. Only Victor and Ezra remained an uncomfortable distance now separating them from both Margaret's group and their retreating father. Sheriff Calhoun sighed heavily, removing his hat to wipe his brow. I'd say that went about as well as could be expected. He nodded to his deputies. Document everything properly. We'll need to remove the remains for official identification. As the lawmen set about their grim task, Margaret found herself standing apart, emotions too complex for simple expression washing through her. The vindication of her father's name should have brought joy, but instead, she felt only a profound sadness for the web of pain and misunderstanding that had entangled so many lives. Harrison moved to stand beside her, his solid presence offering comfort without words. After a moment, Victor approached them, his usual arrogance replaced by an uncharacteristic hesitation. Miss Reed, he began awkwardly, I find myself in the uncomfortable position of owing you an apology. It appears my family has wronged yours gravely and repeatedly. Margaret studied his face, seeing genuine regret beneath the careful control. This was a different Victor than the man who had struck her down in the dirt days earlier, a man grappling with the collapse of certainties he had held his entire life. Why did you believe your father so readily? She asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. About my father being a murderer. Victor's gaze dropped briefly. Augustus Blackwell is not a man one questions lightly. Even his sons. He glanced toward Ezra, who stood apart sullen and watchful. Especially his sons. And now, Harrison prompted. Now, Victor spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. I find myself questioning everything, not just what happened to Uncle Joseph, but all the stories my father has told over the years. He looked directly at Margaret. Including why he wants your land so desperately. Margaret exchanged a glance with Harrison. Do you know something about that? Only rumors, Victor admitted. Talk of government surveyors in the area last year. Something about mineral rights. He shook his head. Father keeps his business dealings close. Before Margaret could press for more details, Sheriff Calhoun approached, his expression grave. We'll be taking the remains to town for proper examination. Miss Reed, I'll need that journal as evidence. Though reluctant to part with this tangible connection to her father, Margaret surrendered the leather-bound book. Take care of it, Sheriff. It's all I have left of him. Calhoun's weathered face softened momentarily. "You have his land, Miss Reed, and now it seems his vindicated name." He tipped his hat and moved away to supervise his deputies. As the afternoon lengthened toward evening, the grim business at the oak tree concluded. The remains of Joseph Hawkins were carefully removed, wrapped in clean canvas, and loaded onto one of the deputies' horses for transport to town. Victor and Ezra departed with terse farewells, their relationship with Margaret fundamentally altered by the day's revelations. Left alone beneath the spreading oak, Margaret and Harrison watched the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in gold and amber hues. "What happens now?" Margaret asked softly. Harrison's weathered face was thoughtful as he surveyed the land around them. "Augustus won't give up easily. He's built his life on certain beliefs that your father was a murderer, that this land should be his. Having those beliefs challenged publicly will only make him more dangerous." "You think he'll come after me again?" "Not directly. Not after today." Harrison's tone held the certainty of a man who understood his adversary. "But he'll find another way. Men like Augustus Blackwell always do." Margaret gazed across her property, seeing it with new eyes, not just as the home she had known all her life, but as something valuable enough that a powerful man would destroy a family's reputation to possess it. "Victor mentioned mineral rights," she mused. "Could there be something valuable beneath our land, something my father didn't know about?" Harrison's expression became guarded. "It's possible. The territorial government has been sending survey teams throughout this region. Gold, silver, coal, Wyoming's future will be built on what lies beneath, as much as what grows above." A new thought struck Margaret with sudden force. The Underground Railroad station, the hidden cellar in the old cabin. Could there be something there, something my father hid, that even you know about? Harrison considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your father was a careful man. Always had contingencies." He glanced at the darkening sky. "It'll be nightfall soon. Best we check the cabin in the morning." Together they walked back toward the ranch house, the events of the day settling over them like the evening shadows stretching across the land. Though exhausted, Margaret felt a strange peace beginning to take root within her, not happiness exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of having defended her father's name. As they reached the porch, Harrison paused, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "Rider coming! Fast!" Margaret squinted against the setting sun, making out a lone figure on horseback, approaching from the direction of town. As the rider drew nearer, she recognized Sheriff Calhoun's lean form, his horse lathered from hard riding. "This can't be good," Harrison muttered, stepping off the porch to meet the lawman. Calhoun reined in his mount sharply, dust billowing around horse and rider. His face was grim as he dismounted. "Thought you should know," he said without preamble. "Augustus has filed formal charges against Margaret with the territorial court. Murder." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "Murder? But we just proved my father didn't kill anyone." "Not your father," Calhoun corrected grimly. "You, Margaret. He's claiming you killed a man named Thomas Whitley 3 days ago. Says the body was found buried on the north edge of your property, not far from where we dug up Hawkins today." "That's absurd," Margaret exclaimed. "I've never even heard of anyone named Thomas Whitley." "Doesn't matter," Calhoun replied, his voice heavy with regret. "Augustus has 3 witnesses who claim they saw you arguing with Whitley in town last week. And the body was found on your land with a bullet in the back of his head." Harrison's face had gone still the way Margaret imagined it must have looked in battle. This is Augustus's revenge for exposing the truth about Hawkins." "Likely," Calhoun agreed. "But my hands are tied. The territorial judge has issued a warrant for Margaret's arrest. I've been ordered to bring her in." "When?" Margaret asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the fear constricting her chest. "Tomorrow morning," Calhoun replied. "I can give you that much time at least." His gaze shifted between Margaret and Harrison. "If I were you, I'd use it wisely." Understanding passed between the men, an unspoken acknowledgement that Calhoun was offering Margaret a chance to flee. "Thank you, Sheriff," Harrison said quietly. Calhoun mounted his horse with a grunt. "Don't thank me. Just be smart about what comes next." With a touch to the brim of his hat, he wheeled his mount and rode away, his figure soon swallowed by the gathering dusk. Margaret stood rooted to the spot, the world seeming to sway beneath her feet. "He's framing me for murder," she whispered, "just as he tried to frame my father." Harrison's hand on her arm steadied her, his touch gentle but firm. "Let's get inside. We need to think this through." Once within the shelter of the ranch house, Harrison moved with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis. He lit lamps against the encroaching darkness, checked and loaded the rifle that had hung above the fireplace, and secured the doors and windows. Margaret watched these preparations with a growing sense of unreality. Just hours ago, she had believed the truth about Joseph Hawkins would end the Blackwell's vendetta against her family. Now she stood accused of a murder she couldn't possibly have committed. "We can't stay here," Harrison stated, breaking her reverie. "By morning, Augustus will have men watching every approach to your property. We need to be gone before dawn." "Where would we go?" Margaret asked, the enormity of her situation beginning to sink in. "If I run, I'll look guilty. If I surrender, I'll hang for a murder I didn't commit." "There's a third option," Harrison said, his voice steady. "We find proof of Augustus's deception. Evidence that this Thomas Whitley either doesn't exist or was killed by Blackwell's men to frame you." "How?" In one night, Harrison's weathered face was resolute in the lamplight. "By finding what Augustus really wants on your land. Something valuable enough to commit murder for twice." "The cabin," Margaret said, understanding immediately. "We need to check the Underground Railroad station." Harrison nodded. "As soon as it's full dark. For now, gather only what you absolutely need. We may be traveling fast, and light come morning." As Margaret moved through the small house collecting essentials, a change of clothing, her father's watch, a small framed photograph of her parents on their wedding day. The reality of her situation crashed over her in waves. She might never return to this house, this land that had been her home for all of her 26 years. The thought burned like a physical pain, sharper than her still-healing injuries. This was the legacy her father had built, the earth he had tended with his own hands, the place where her mother's garden had once bloomed in colorful profusion. To abandon it felt like a betrayal of everything they had sacrificed. Yet, what choice did she have? Augustus Blackwell had revealed the lengths to which he would go to possess the Reed property. A fabricated murder charge was merely his latest move in a game where human lives were pawns to be sacrificed. When darkness had fully claimed the land, Harrison doused the lamps, and they slipped out the back door, moving like shadows across the moonlit property toward the old cabin. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant pine, a familiar perfume that Margaret breathed deeply, wondering if it might be her last night on Reed land. The cabin stood as it had for decades, weathered but solid, a testament to the craftsmanship of those who had built it before Margaret was born. Harrison eased the door open, wincing at its inevitable creak, and they stepped into the absolute darkness of the interior. A match flared its small flame, illuminating Harrison's face in sharp relief as he lit a small lantern he had brought from the house. In its golden glow, the cabin's contents emerged from shadow old tack, hanging from pegs crates stacked against walls, farming implements with handles worn smooth from years of use. Without discussion, they moved toward the back of the cabin where several wooden crates were stacked against the wall. With practiced efficiency, Harrison shifted them aside, revealing the section of plank flooring that concealed the trapdoor. "Here," he said softly, finding the almost invisible gap between two boards. With slight pressure, the trapdoor opened, revealing the dark space beneath. Margaret's heart pounded as Harrison directed the lantern's light into the opening. The small cellar below had once sheltered runaway slaves on their journey to freedom, men, women, and children her father had risked everything to help. Now it might hold the key to her own freedom from Augustus Blackwell's vengeful machinations. Harrison lowered himself into the space, then reached up to help Margaret down. The cellar was perhaps 8 feet square, its earthen walls shored up with rough-hewn timbers, its ceiling low enough that Harrison had to stoop to avoid hitting his head. "What are we looking for?" Margaret whispered, though there was no one to overhear them. Harrison swept the lantern in a slow arc, illuminating the cellar's sparse contents. A rough pallet, in one corner, a shelf with a few dusty tins and jars, a small table with a bench. "Anything that seems out of place. Anything your father might have hidden." They searched methodically, checking beneath the pallet behind the shelf under the table. Nothing revealed itself as unusual or significant. "There has to be something," Margaret insisted, frustration edging her voice. "Why else would Augustus want our land so desperately?" Harrison set the lantern on the table, its light casting elongated shadows up the earthen walls. "Think, Margaret. Your father was a methodical man. If he hid something important, he'd have left clues, something only you would recognize." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to channel her father's thought process. Jonathan Reed had been quiet but thorough, a man who planned for contingencies and left nothing to chance. If he had hidden something of value, where would he have placed it? Her gaze traveled around the small space, seeing it as her father might have. The pallet, where exhausted fugitives had rested. The shelf, with meager provisions to sustain them. The table, where perhaps her father had sat, recording their names and destinations in his journal. The journal. "The maps," she said, suddenly, eyes widening with realization. "In the journal we found earlier, there were maps of the Underground Railroad routes." Harrison nodded slowly, understanding dawning. And one of those routes might have led to something more than freedom. "We need to get back to the house," Margaret urged. "My father kept copies of everything. There might be duplicates of those maps in his desk." They climbed quickly from the cellar, Harrison pausing only long enough to secure the trapdoor and replace the crates that concealed it. The night remained quiet around them as they made their way back to the ranch house, though Margaret couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes watching their movements. Inside, they lit a single lamp, keeping it low to avoid announcing their presence to anyone who might be observing the property from a distance. Margaret moved to her father's small desk in the corner of the main room, pulling open drawers and rifling through their contents with growing urgency. "Here," she said at last, withdrawing a folded paper from beneath a false bottom in the central drawer. "Another map." Harrison spread it on the desk's surface, his expression intent, as he studied the carefully drawn lines and markings. Unlike the maps they had seen earlier, which showed routes across states and territories, this one depicted a much smaller area, the Reed property and surrounding lands. "These markings," Harrison murmured, pointing to a series of small symbols scattered across the map. "They're not part of the standard Underground Railroad code." Margaret leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his as they examined the markings together. "They look like survey notations," she said, recalling the maps she had sometimes seen in the Territorial Land Office when accompanying her father on business. "Exactly," Harrison agreed, a new urgency in his tone. "These are geological survey marks." His finger traced a line that ran directly beneath the Reed Ranch house, continuing north toward the boundary of Blackwell land. "Your father was documenting something underground. Something valuable." "Gold," Margaret suggested, remembering Victor's mention of mineral rights. Harrison shook his head slowly. "Not in this region, but there's something else just as valuable in Wyoming territory." His weathered face was grave in the lamplight. "Coal, the future of America's railroads and industries." The realization struck Margaret with physical force. "A coal seam, running beneath our property, and likely extending under Blackwell land as well," Harrison confirmed. "But mining rights go to whoever owns the surface property where the seam is most accessible." He studied the map more closely. "According to these markings, the best access point is right here." His finger tapped a spot near the north field, precisely where they had exhumed Joseph Hawkins's remains earlier that day. "The oak tree," Margaret breathed. "That's why Augustus was so upset when we dug there. Not just because of Hawkins, but because your father knew about the coal," Harrison finished for her. "And Augustus suspected he did. That's why he's been so determined to get your land by any means necessary." "But how did my father know?" Margaret wondered aloud. "He wasn't a geologist or surveyor." Harrison's expression turned pensive. "During the war, your father served briefly with the Army Corps of Engineers. He had an eye for terrain, for what lay beneath the surface." He tapped the map again. "These markings are amateur but accurate. Jonathan must have discovered the coal seam years ago, perhaps, while digging Hawkins's grave." "And kept it secret," Margaret mused, "even from me." "To protect you," Harrison suggested gently. "Knowledge like this can be dangerous, as you've discovered." The implications unfolded in Margaret's mind like a map being slowly revealed. Her father had discovered a valuable coal seam beneath their modest ranch. Augustus Blackwell had somehow learned of its existence, perhaps through the territorial surveyors Victor had mentioned, and had been willing to destroy the Reed family to possess it. "This is it," she said, a new determination flooding her voice. "This is what we need to expose Augustus. Proof that he's after our land for the coal, not out of some misguided sense of justice for Joseph Hawkins." Harrison's expression remained troubled. "It's compelling, but not enough to counter a murder charge. Augustus has created physical evidence against you, a body on your land, witnesses who will swear to seeing you with the victim." "Then we need to find this Thomas Whitley," Margaret declared, "or prove he never existed in the first place." "That's not something we can accomplish before morning," Harrison cautioned. "We need to leave, Margaret, tonight. Find somewhere safe until we can gather the evidence we need." Margaret stared down at the map, her father's careful notations a testament to the secret he had carried alone for years. The knowledge that her modest ranch might be sitting atop a fortune in coal should have been exhilarating. Instead, it felt like a curse. The reason her father had died alone while she was away at school, the reason the Blackwells had brutalized her, the reason she now stood falsely accused of murder. "Where would we go?" she asked, the weight of exhaustion suddenly pressing down upon her. Harrison carefully refolded the map and handed it to her. "I know a place, people who can be trusted, but we need to move now, while darkness still gives us cover." As Margaret tucked the map securely into her pocket, a sound from outside froze them both in place, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, followed by the shattering of the window beside them. "Down!" Harrison commanded, his body moving with battlefield instinct, as he tackled Margaret to the floor, shielding her with his larger frame, as glass rained around them. Another shot punched through the wooden wall, inches above their heads, splinters flying. Then another, and another, a fusillade that spoke of multiple shooters surrounding the house. "Blackwell's men," Harrison growled, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He's not waiting for the law to take you in the morning." "What do we do?" Margaret asked, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Harrison's eyes met hers in the dim lamplight, his expression grim but resolute. "We fight. Then we run." The wooden walls of the Reed ranch house splintered as bullets tore through them from all sides. Harrison pulled Margaret toward the back of the house, keeping low to avoid the deadly fire. The lamp they'd been using crashed to the floor, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by muzzle flashes from outside. "How many?" Margaret whispered, her voice steady, despite the terror gripping her chest. Harrison peered carefully through a small gap in the curtains. "At least 5. Maybe more in the shadows." His weathered face was grim in the fleeting illumination of gunfire. "They've surrounded the house." "Blackwell's men. Has to be." Harrison checked his rifle with practiced hands. "Augustus isn't waiting for the law to hang you. He wants this finished tonight." Another volley of shots tore through the front window, sending glass and splinters flying across the room. The shooters were growing bolder, their fire more concentrated. "They're moving closer," Harrison observed, "getting ready to storm the house." He handed Margaret her father's old revolver from the desk drawer. "You remember how to use this?" She nodded, the weight of the gun familiar in her hand. Jonathan Reed had taught his daughter to shoot as soon as she could lift a firearm, believing that, in Wyoming territory, survival often depended on self-sufficiency. "We need to reach the barn," Harrison said, his voice low and urgent. "There's a back way out through the root cellar. It emerges in the cottonwood grove beyond the north fence line." Margaret's eyes widened. "How do you know about that? Even I barely remember it." A shadow of something, regret perhaps, or long-buried secrets, crossed Harrison's face. "Your father and I built it, after Hawkins, just in case." Before Margaret could process this revelation, a heavy thud against the back door announced a new threat. "They're trying to break in," she whispered. Harrison nodded grimly. "We need a diversion." He moved to the stone fireplace and quickly rummaged through the kindling box, emerging with a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Coal oil," he explained at Margaret's questioning look. "For emergencies." Understanding dawned. "You want to set fire to my home. Just enough smoke to cover our escape." Harrison's eyes were apologetic, but resolute. "It's the house or our lives, Margaret." She swallowed hard, but nodded. Her father had built this house, had died within its walls. But he had also taught her that land endured while structures could be rebuilt. "Do it!" Harrison worked quickly, splashing coal oil on a pile of newspapers in the far corner of the main room, away from their planned escape route. "When I light this, we move fast. Head for the barn, stay low, and don't look back." Margaret clutched the revolver tightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm ready." Harrison struck a match, the small flame briefly illuminating his determined expression, before he tossed it onto the oil-soaked papers. Fire bloomed instantly, crackling as it caught and spread. "Now!" Harrison hissed, grabbing Margaret's arm and pulling her toward the kitchen at the rear of the house. They burst through the back door just as smoke began to fill the main room. The sudden action caught the nearest shooter by surprise, a burly man with a bandana obscuring his lower face. Before he could raise his rifle, Harrison struck him with the butt of his own weapon, sending him sprawling unconscious to the ground. "Run!" Harrison urged, propelling Margaret forward as shouts of alarm rang out from the front of the house. They sprinted across the open yard between house and barn, bullets kicking up dust at their heels. Margaret felt a hot sting across her upper arm as a shot grazed her, but adrenaline pushed her forward without breaking stride. The barn loomed before them, its weathered doors hanging slightly open. Harrison reached it first, pulling Margaret inside, before slamming the doors shut and dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. "That won't hold them long," he panted, already moving toward the back of the structure. "The root cellar entrance is beneath those hay bales." Together, they shifted the bales, revealing a trapdoor set into the earthen floor. Harrison yanked it open as the first blows landed against the barn doors, the wood shuddering under the impact. "Go!" he ordered, helping Margaret down into the darkness below. "I'll be right behind you." The root cellar was cool and musty, the air thick with the earthy scent of stored vegetables and damp soil. A narrow tunnel extended from its far wall, barely tall enough for a man to navigate in a crouch shored up with timber supports that creaked with age. Harrison dropped down beside her, closing the trapdoor above them. "This leads all the way to the cottonwood grove," he explained, striking a match to light a small stub of candle he produced from his pocket. "Your father designed it, after helping so many others escape. Said every man should have a back door." In the flickering candlelight, Harrison's face appeared older, lined with fatigue and worry. For the first time, Margaret truly saw the weight of years and responsibility he carried, not just for her safety now, but for promises made long ago to her father. "You and my father were more than war comrades," she said, the realization crystallizing with sudden clarity. "The way you know this land, the promises you made him. There's something you're not telling me." A crash from above interrupted any response Harrison might have made. "They're in the barn," he whispered. "We need to move." Leading the way with the candle held before him, Harrison entered the narrow tunnel, Margaret close behind. The passage was claustrophobic, the walls pressing in on either side, the ceiling so low they had to stoop constantly. The air grew thinner as they progressed, dust and earth mingling with the smoke they'd carried with them from the house. Margaret tried to focus on Harrison's back, ahead of her, on the steady movement forward, rather than the weight of earth above. Yet her mind raced with questions about Harrison's connection to her father, about Augustus Blackwell's ruthless determination, about what would happen if they escaped this night, only to face a territory-wide manhunt tomorrow. After what seemed an eternity of crouching and crawling, the tunnel began to slope upward. Fresh air wafted down to meet them, carrying the sweet scent of cottonwood leaves and night-blooming flowers. "We're almost there," Harrison murmured, extinguishing the candle as a faint shimmer of moonlight became visible ahead. The tunnel's exit was concealed beneath the sprawling roots of an ancient cottonwood, screened by undergrowth that had been deliberately cultivated to hide the opening. Harrison pushed aside the vegetation and emerged cautiously, scanning the surroundings before signaling Margaret to follow. They found themselves in a small grove of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile north of the ranch house. In the distance, an orange glow illuminated the night sky. The fire they'd started had spread, engulfing the entire structure. "My home," Margaret whispered, watching the flames consume the only place she had ever truly belonged. Harrison's hand found her shoulder, a steady pressure offering comfort without words. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Your father would understand." Margaret nodded, forcing back tears that wouldn't help their current situation. "Where do we go now?" "North," Harrison decided, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Into the high country. I have friends there, people who knew your father who will help us." "How far?" 2 days hard riding." Harrison glanced at the blood seeping through the sleeve of her dress where the bullet had grazed her. "Can you manage?" Margaret straightened her spine, ignoring the pain that radiated from both her fresh wound and her still-healing injuries from the Blackwells' earlier attack. "I'm Jonathan Reed's daughter," she said by way of answer. "I can manage." A ghost of a smile touched Harrison's lips. "That you are." He gestured toward a thicket of juniper at the edge of the grove. "I left horses there earlier today. A precaution." "You anticipated this?" Harrison's expression turned grim. "I've known Augustus Blackwell for 20 years, Margaret. Violence is his first solution, not his last resort." They moved carefully through the cottonwood grove, alert for any sound that might indicate pursuit. Behind them, shouts could be heard as Blackwell's men discovered the tunnel beneath the barn. "They'll follow," Margaret observed. Harrison nodded. "Eventually, but they'll have to get horses first, and we have a head start." His voice held the calm assurance of a man who had escaped pursuit before. True to his word, 2 horses waited in the juniper thicket, a sturdy bay gelding, and the sorrel mare Margaret had ridden earlier. Saddlebags bulged with provisions and rifles were secured in scabbards, evidence of Harrison's thorough preparation for their flight. "You knew we'd have to leave," Margaret said as she mounted the mare, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounded arm. Harrison swung into his own saddle with the fluid grace of a lifelong horseman. "I hoped we wouldn't," he corrected, "but I planned as if we would." He turned his mount northward toward the dark silhouette of the mountains against the star-strewn sky. "It's what your father would have done." As they rode away from the only home Margaret had ever known, she cast one final glance back at the distant glow of the burning ranch house. The sight etched itself into her memory, a peer for her past, for the simple life she had led before Augustus Blackwell's vendetta had shattered everything. Yet as they urged their horses into a ground-covering lope, something unexpected stirred within Margaret's heart. Not just grief for what was lost, but a fierce determination that transcended fear and uncertainty. Whatever lay ahead, pursuit, danger, the fight to clear her name, she would face it with the same courage her father had shown throughout his life. The silver pocket watch rested in her pocket, its hands forever marking her father's final moment. But Jonathan Reed's legacy lived on in his daughter, in the strength that drove her forward into the darkness, away from all she had known, and toward an uncertain future. The night enfolded them as they rode 2 silhouettes against the vast Wyoming landscape, disappearing into the shadows as the flames of the Reed Ranch burned ever brighter behind them. Dawn found them high in the foothills of the Wind River Range, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in bands of gold and crimson. They had ridden through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and tend to Margaret's wound, a shallow furrow across her upper arm that Harrison had cleaned and bandaged with supplies from his saddlebags. Margaret's body ached with exhaustion, but a strange calm had settled over her spirit. The initial shock of fleeing her burning home had given way to a clear-eyed resolve. She was alive. She was free. And she carried with her the map that revealed what Augustus Blackwell truly wanted, evidence that might yet vindicate both her and her father's memory. "How much farther?" she asked, as Harrison led them up a narrow game trail that switchbacked steeply through pine and aspen. "Not far now," he replied, his voice betraying little of the fatigue he must surely feel after the night's exertions. "There's a high meadow just over this ridge. Ruby's brother has a cabin there off any marked trail, hidden from casual discovery." "Ruby's brother," Harrison nodded, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. "Isaiah Washington. Came west after the war, built himself a place where he wouldn't have to answer to any man." A note of respect colored his voice. "Makes his living trapping and guiding. Knows these mountains better than any white man alive." As they crested the ridge, a panoramic vista opened before them, a hidden valley nestled among towering peaks, its floor carpeted with wildflowers and bisected by a clear stream that sparkled in the morning light. On the far side, nearly invisible against the backdrop of pine forest, stood a small log cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Beautiful! Margaret breathed momentarily, forgetting her exhaustion and the circumstances that had brought them to this remote sanctuary. Harrison's weathered face softened as he surveyed the valley. "Your father and I spent a summer up here before you were born. He always said it was the closest thing to heaven a man could find on earth." Before Margaret could question him further about this shared past, a figure emerged from the cabin, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with iron-gray hair and a full beard. He stood watching their approach, one hand resting casually on the rifle propped against the cabin wall. "That's far enough," he called when they were within earshot, his deep voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "State your business." "It's Harrison Grayson Isaiah," Harrison called back, "with Jonathan Reed's daughter." The man's stance relaxed visibly. "Harrison been a dog's age." He strode forward to meet them, moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to wilderness terrain. "Ruby sent word you might be coming. Said you had Blackwell trouble." "The worst kind," Harrison confirmed as they dismounted. "Margaret, this is Isaiah Washington, Isaiah Margaret Reed." Isaiah studied Margaret with keen, dark eyes that missed of nothing. Her exhaustion, the blood-stained bandage on her arm, the determination etched in her young face. "You look like your mother," he said finally, "but you've got Jonathan's steel in your spine." He gestured toward the cabin. "Come on in. You both look dead on your feet." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable. A single room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with benches, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves lined with books, supplies, and what appeared to be carefully preserved botanical specimens. "Sit before you fall down," Isaiah instructed, moving to the fire where a pot of coffee simmered. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday noon," Harrison admitted as they sank gratefully onto the benches. Isaiah shook his head in disapproval, pouring coffee into tin cups before retrieving a pot of stew that had been keeping warm at the edge of the hearth. "No wonder you both look half dead. Eat first, then talk." The stew venison with wild onions and roots Isaiah had gathered from the mountains revived their strength and spirits. Margaret hadn't realized how desperately hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant calling of birds in the pines outside. When they had finished, and the edge taken off their hunger and fatigue, Isaiah settled onto a stool opposite them. "Now then," he said, his deep voice gentle but firm, "tell me what brings Jonathan Reed's daughter to my doorstep with a bullet graze and the look of someone running for her life." Between them, Margaret and Harrison related the events of the past days, the attack by the Blackwell brothers, Harrison's rescue, the discovery of the journals and the truth about Joseph Hawkins, the exhumation of the body, and finally, Augustus Blackwell's trumped-up murder charge and the attack on the ranch. Isaiah listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When they finished with their flight through the secret tunnel and night ride into the mountains, he shook his head slowly. "Augustus Blackwell," he said, the name itself sounding like a curse on his lips. "Man's had the devil in him since before the war. Even his own family fears him more than respects him." "You know him?" Margaret asked. "Know of him," Isaiah clarified. "Man like that casts a long shadow. Heard stories from folks passing through how he built his empire on others' misfortunes, how those who cross him tend to meet with accidents." His gaze shifted to Harrison. "Your showing up at the Reed place when you did wasn't coincidence, was it?" Harrison's eyes met Isaiah's with the wordless communication of old friends who share secrets. "No," he admitted. "I've been watching Augustus's movements for months. When I heard rumors that the Blackwell boys were planning to confront Margaret about selling the ranch, I made sure I was nearby." Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "You still haven't told me the whole truth about your connection to my father." A heavy silence filled the cabin. Harrison stared into his coffee as if searching for words, while Isaiah watched them both with knowing eyes. "She deserves the truth, Harrison," Isaiah said quietly. "Jonathan would want her to know." Harrison nodded slowly, his expression more vulnerable than Margaret had yet seen it. "You're right." He raised his gaze to meet Margaret's directly. "Your father and I weren't just war comrades or business partners in the Underground Railroad. We were brothers." Margaret stared at him in shock. "Brothers, but you have different last names." "Different." "Half-brothers," Harrison clarified. "Same father, different mothers. My mother was our father's first wife, died when I was young. He remarried and had Jonathan years later." A sad smile touched his lips. "We didn't even know about each other until we met by chance at Antietam. Recognized something familiar in each other's faces, got to talking. Discovered we shared a father." The revelation stunned Margaret into silence. Her father had never mentioned having a half-brother, had never given any indication that the family extended beyond the small circle of their ranch life. "Why didn't he tell me?" she finally asked, hurt coloring her voice. "Your grandfather, our father, wasn't a good man," Harrison explained gently. "He abandoned my mother before I was born, then did the same to Jonathan and his mother years later. Your father didn't like speaking of him." He hesitated, then added, "And there were other reasons, practical ones." "The Underground Railroad," Isaiah supplied. "Safer if fewer people knew the connection. If one of you was caught, the other could still continue the work." Harrison nodded. "And after Hawkins, after your father buried him on Reed Land, we thought it best to maintain some distance. For your protection." Margaret's mind reeled with this new understanding of her family history. The father she had thought she knew completely had carried secrets even from his beloved daughter. A half-brother, a shameful paternal legacy, carefully maintained distances meant to protect her. "That's why you came when he died," she said slowly, pieces falling into place, "not just as an old friend paying respects, but as family." "He asked me to watch over you," Harrison confirmed, "made me promise before he passed. Said you were stubborn as the day is long, another Reed trait, and would need looking after, though you'd never admit it." Despite everything, a smile tugged at Margaret's lips. That sounded exactly like her father. "So you're my uncle," she said, testing the word. Harrison's weathered face softened. "I am, though I'd have come even without the blood tie. Your father was the best man I ever knew. What Augustus Blackwell is doing to his legacy to you—" His voice hardened. "I won't stand for it." "None of us will," Isaiah added firmly. "Jonathan Reed helped my sister when she had nowhere else to turn. Helped dozens like her find freedom. His daughter won't face Blackwell's vengeance alone." As the morning wore on, their conversation turned to the Blackwell brothers and the complex family dynamics at play. Isaiah, who had lived in the territory since the late 1860s, had observed the Blackwells from a distance for decades. Victor was always different from his brother, Isaiah noted, stoking the fire. Thoughtful even as a boy. Used to see him riding alone in the hills, looking like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "And Ezra?" Margaret asked, remembering the younger Blackwell's casual cruelty during her beating. Isaiah's expression darkened. "Mean streak a mile wide, even as a child. They say it started after their mother died. Influenza took her when Ezra was just 7. Victor had a few more years with her, learned some kindness. But Ezra, he shook his head. Boy was raised by Augustus alone during his formative years, and Augustus never recovered from his wife's death, grew harder, more bitter, took it out on everyone around him, especially his sons. He was hardest on Ezra, Harrison added, always comparing him to Victor, finding him wanting. Seems to have twisted something in the boy, made him desperate to prove himself to outdo his brother in their father's eyes, especially in showing loyalty and ruthlessness. Margaret thought of Ezra's face during her beating, the gleam in his eyes that went beyond simple enforcement of his father's will, the enjoyment he seemed to take in causing pain. It made a terrible kind of sense now. "Victor and I were friends once," she said softly, the memory surfacing from years past. "When we were children, before his mother died." Harrison looked at her with surprise. "You never mentioned that." "It was long ago." Margaret stared into the fire, remembering. "His family's ranch borders ours to the north. When we were 10 or 11, we used to meet at the creek that runs between our properties. Skip stones. Talk about books." A wistful smile touched her lips. "Victor taught me to fish with a hand line. I taught him to identify wildflowers. Then his mother died, and Augustus pulled him away from school. Started grooming him to take over the family business. We didn't speak again until he and Ezra came to force you off your land," Harrison finished grimly. Margaret nodded, her expression troubled. "When he hit me, there was something in his eyes. Regret, maybe. As if he remembered who we'd been to each other once upon a time." "Might be useful," Isaiah observed thoughtfully. "A crack in the Blackwell armor. A man divided against himself can't stand firm for long." The conversation turned to more immediate concerns: how to gather evidence of Augustus's frame-up, how to prove Margaret's innocence, how to reclaim her property and clear her father's name. They discussed plans and contingencies deep into the afternoon, until Isaiah finally declared they all needed rest before any more decisions could be made. As Margaret settled onto the narrow bed Isaiah had insisted she take, her thoughts drifted to Victor Blackwell, the thoughtful boy she had once known, the conflicted man he might have become beneath his father's harsh influence. If there was indeed a crack in his loyalty to Augustus, perhaps there was hope yet for justice. With that thought, providing a small measure of comfort, she surrendered to exhaustion. The silver pocket watch clutched in her hand like a talisman against the darkness. The abandoned Miller homestead stood in a small clearing about 5 miles east of Redemption Springs, a weathered cabin with a partially collapsed roof, a listing barn whose doors had long since fallen from their hinges, and an overgrown garden where wildflowers now bloomed among the remnants of what had once been orderly rows of vegetables. The Millers had moved on years ago, driven out by a succession of harsh winters and poor harvests, but the buildings remained as silent sentinels of another family's shattered dreams. Margaret approached from the north, riding alone as planned, though she knew Harrison was positioned on the ridge above with his rifle, and Isaiah waited with fresh horses in a stand of pines a quarter-mile to the east. The midday sun beat down on her shoulders as she guided her mare through tall grass toward the dilapidated cabin, tension coiled tight in her chest. Victor might already be inside waiting, or this might be a trap with Augustus's men ready to capture or kill her. Either way, she was committed now. She dismounted at the edge of the clearing, tethering her horse loosely to allow for a quick escape if needed. The silver pocket watch felt heavy in her pocket, as did her father's revolver tucked into the waistband of her skirt. Drawing a deep breath, she walked the remaining distance to the cabin, boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. "Victor!" she called, pausing at the threshold of the open doorway. The cabin's interior lay in shadow, making it impossible to see if anyone waited within. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a voice emerged from the darkness, not Victor's, but one she recognized with a chill of dread. "He's not coming, Miss Reed." Ezra Blackwell stepped into the doorway, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that didn't reach his cold eyes. Though he certainly wanted to, Margaret took an instinctive step backward, her hand moving toward her concealed weapon. Ezra was alone as far as she could see, but his presence here could only mean trouble. "Where's Victor?" she demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. Indisposed, Ezra advanced another step, forcing her to retreat further. "Father caught him trying to remove some private papers from the safe this morning. There was quite a scene." He chuckled, a sound devoid of genuine mirth. "Always knew Victor was soft. Now Father knows it too." Margaret's mind raced. Victor had tried to get Augustus's journal as promised, but had been caught. Now he was in danger, and so was she. "So Augustus sent you instead," she concluded, taking another step back, calculating the distance to her horse. "Father doesn't know I'm here." Something shifted in Ezra's expression, a flicker of resentment quickly masked. "Doesn't trust me with important matters. Always been Victor's domain." He moved forward again, forcing Margaret to continue her retreat. "But I saw the note Victor was writing to you, figured I'd come in his place. Settle things between the Reed and Blackwell families once and for all." His hand moved to his hip, where a revolver hung in a polished leather holster. Margaret tensed, preparing to dive for cover, knowing Harrison would fire at the first sign of a drawn weapon. But before Ezra could complete the motion, a new voice broke the tense silence. "That's enough, little brother." Victor Blackwell emerged from the barn, his face bruised, a cut above his right eye crusted with dried blood. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone nursing cracked ribs, but his expression was resolute as he trained his own revolver on Ezra's back. Ezra froze, then slowly turned his face, registering first shock, then bitter amusement. "Well, well, the prodigal son escaped his punishment. Father will be most displeased." "Father has been displeased with me my entire life," Victor replied evenly. "It's lost its sting." He gestured with the barrel of his gun. "Step away from Miss Reed." "Or what?" Ezra's voice took on a taunting edge. "You'll shoot your own brother. We both know you don't have the spine for that Victor. Never have." "People change," Victor replied, his aim unwavering. "Sometimes all at once, when they finally see clearly what they've become and what they've allowed others to become." Margaret watched the standoff between the brothers, heart pounding. This wasn't just about her or the land anymore. This was a family fracture, years in the making, finally breaking open in this desolate clearing. "You're a fool." Ezra spat, his composure cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "Throwing away everything Father built for us. And for what? Some worthless piece of land? Or is it the Reed girl you've always mooned over?" His lips curved in a cruel smile as he glanced at Margaret. "Father was right. You're weak, sentimental, unfit to lead the Blackwell legacy." "The Blackwell legacy?" Victor almost laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "Do you even know what that is, Ezra? Corruption, exploitation, threats and bribes and violence. Is that what you're so eager to inherit?" "It's power," Ezra shot back, "and I'm not afraid to wield it, unlike you." "It's poison," Victor countered. "It killed whatever good was in Father after Mother died. It's killing you now, though you're too blind to see it." He took a careful step forward. "But it stops with me. I won't let it consume you too, little brother, even if you hate me for it." Something flickered in Ezra's eyes, confusion perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of the vulnerable boy he had once been, before Augustus Blackwell's ambition had twisted him. For a heartbeat, Margaret thought she saw a crack in his hardened exterior. Then the moment passed, and Ezra's hand darted toward his holster. No! Victor lunged forward, but he was slowed by his injuries. Margaret acted without conscious thought, drawing her father's revolver and firing in one fluid motion. The shot cracked across the clearing, and Ezra staggered his own gun, falling unfired from suddenly nerveless fingers. He looked down with almost comical surprise at the spreading red stain on his left shoulder, then back up at Margaret. "Well," he said, a strange smile twisting his lips, "seems the Reed girl has more spine than both of us, brother." His knees buckled and Victor caught him before he could hit the ground, lowering him carefully onto the sun-baked earth. "You damn fool," he muttered, though whether to Ezra or himself wasn't clear. The sound of galloping hooves announced Harrison's arrival rifle at the ready as he took in the scene before him. "Everyone all right?" he called, dismounting without taking his eyes off Ezra. "She winged me," Ezra replied with a pained laugh. "Nothing fatal, though father might finish the job when he finds out I failed." Victor was already removing his bandana to press against the wound. "No one's failing or finishing anything today," he said firmly. "This has gone far enough." Margaret approached cautiously, her revolver still held loosely at her side. "You tried to get the journal," she said to Victor. He nodded, grimacing as he applied pressure to Ezra's wound. "I was careless. Father walked into his study earlier than expected. He has the journal locked in the bank vault now, beyond my reach." He looked up at Margaret, regret etched in his features. "I'm sorry." "Not your fault," she assured him, holstering her weapon. "But without that journal, I don't see how we can prove my innocence." "Maybe you can't," Ezra interjected, his voice strained but his eyes suddenly alert with a calculation that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of Augustus. "But I can." They all stared at him, suspicion warring with cautious hope. "Why would you help?" Harrison demanded, voicing what they all were thinking. Ezra's smile was sharp despite his pain. "Self-interest, old man. Father was ready to disown Victor this morning, said he'd make me his sole heir if I proved my loyalty." He shifted, wincing. "But I've watched how Father operates for 28 years. Victor's right about one thing. There's no loyalty in Augustus Blackwell, only usefulness. Once Victor's gone, I'll be the next to disappoint him, the next to be discarded." He looked at his brother, something almost like vulnerability flickering across his face. "Besides, it'll infuriate Father. And after a lifetime of trying and failing to earn his approval, that suddenly seems like reward enough." Victor studied his brother's face, searching for deception. "What did you have in mind?" "I was there when Father created the Whitley fiction. Watched him pay off the witnesses, arrange for the body to be planted on Reed land." Ezra's expression hardened. "I even helped God help me. I can testify to all of it. The fraud, the frame-up, everything." "Your word against your father's," Harrison pointed out skeptically. "A territorial judge might be reluctant to accept it, especially given your history." "Not just my word." Ezra reached carefully into his jacket with his good hand, wincing at the movement. "I made copies of certain pages from Father's journal months ago. Insurance, you might call it." He withdrew a small leather portfolio. "I've learned a few things watching Augustus Blackwell all these years. Chief among them, always have leverage." Margaret took the portfolio with trembling hands. Inside were several pages of careful handwriting, detailing plans to acquire the Reed property, references to the coal and silver deposits, and most damning of all, explicit instructions for fabricating evidence against Margaret Reed in the unlikely event that the Hawkins matter was resolved in her favor. "It's not the entire journal," Ezra acknowledged, "but it's enough to raise serious questions about Father's accusations, especially if delivered to the territorial judge by Augustus Blackwell's own son." Victor stared at his brother, emotions warring on his face, disbelief, hope, and a wary gratitude. "Why didn't you tell me you had these?" Ezra's smile was tight with pain. "Not all of us wear our hearts on our sleeves, brother. Some of us play our cards closer to the chest." The smile faded. "Besides, until today, I wasn't sure which side I was on." The sound of approaching horses interrupted any response Victor might have made. Isaiah Washington appeared at the edge of the clearing, leading 2 fresh mounts. "Thought I heard gunfire," he called, his deep voice carrying across the open space. "Everything all right?" "We have what we need," Harrison replied, gesturing to the portfolio in Margaret's hands, "and an unexpected ally." He nodded toward Ezra, who was now pale from blood loss, but still conscious. "We need to get him to a doctor, then make for the county seat. The territorial judge will be holding court there tomorrow." Victor helped his brother to his feet. "We'll take my horse. I can ride double with him to town." Margaret approached the brothers, studying Ezra's face with guarded hope. "Why the change of heart? Really?" Ezra met her gaze, his customary arrogance momentarily set aside. "Let's just say I finally understood what it means to be a Blackwell, and decided I'd rather be something else." His eyes shifted to his brother. "Isn't that right, Victor?" Victor nodded, a complex understanding passing between them. "It's never too late to choose a different path. Father taught us that, though not in the way he intended." As they prepared to depart, the Blackwell brothers for the doctor in Redemption Springs, Margaret and Harrison for the county seat to file their evidence with the territorial judge, Margaret felt a cautious hope unfurling within her chest. The path to clearing her name was still fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time since Augustus Blackwell had accused her of murder, she could see a way forward. The silver pocket watch rested against her heart, its stopped hands marking a moment frozen in time. Yet, as she mounted her horse and turned toward the future that awaited, she felt as though something long stalled had finally begun to move again. Not just the wheels of justice, but time itself flowing forward after months of grief and stasis. She looked back once at Victor supporting his wounded brother, at the unlikely alliance forged this day from shared trauma, and the courage to break free from the past. Then she urged her horse forward, riding toward whatever justice awaited. The county courthouse stood imposing against the clear September sky, its brick facade and white columns lending an air of permanence and authority that few buildings in the Wyoming Territory could claim. Inside the main courtroom buzzed with tension and anticipation as the territorial judge Hiram Daniels prepared to hear the most controversial case of the session. Margaret sat at a small table near the front, Harrison beside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Across the aisle, Augustus Blackwell occupied a similar table with his attorney, his silver beard neatly trimmed, his clothing impeccable as always. But the customary confidence in his bearing had been replaced by a barely contained fury that manifested in the tight set of his jaw and the cold fire in his eyes. He had not once looked directly at Margaret since entering the courtroom. The gallery behind them was packed with curious onlookers, townsfolk from Redemption Springs who had made the journey to witness what promised to be the most sensational legal drama the territory had seen in years. Sheriff Calhoun sat in the front row, his weathered face carefully neutral, though Margaret had caught the slight nod of acknowledgement he'd given her when she entered. At the stroke of 10, Judge Daniels entered the courtroom, a tall man with iron-gray hair and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. As the court was called to order, Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. Everything hinged on the next few hours: her freedom, her land, her father's reputation, her very life. "We are here today," the judge began after settling into his chair, "to address serious allegations of judicial fraud and witness tampering in the matter of the Territory versus Margaret Reed." His gaze swept the room before settling on Margaret. "Miss Reed, you stand accused of the murder of one Thomas Whitley. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. "And I further assert that the charges against me are fabricated, part of a scheme to seize my property through false accusation." A murmur ran through the gallery. The judge silenced it with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Those are grave allegations, Miss Reed. I assume you have evidence to support them." "We do, Your Honor," Harrison replied, rising to his feet. "If it please the court, we wish to call our first witness, Victor Blackwell." Augustus stiffened visibly as his son entered from a side door. Victor walked with the careful deliberation of a man still nursing injuries, but his head was high, his eyes clear as they briefly met his father's before looking away. He took the oath with a steady voice, then settled into the witness chair. For the next hour, Victor laid out a devastating account of his father's machinations: the discovery of coal and silver deposits beneath Reed land, the years-long campaign to acquire the property, the fabrication of murder charges when all other efforts had failed. He produced documents, named names, specified dates, and amounts paid to false witnesses. Throughout the testimony, Augustus Blackwell sat rigid with fury, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorney, but otherwise maintaining a facade of contemptuous disbelief. When Victor finished his account, the attorney rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Blackwell," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that you've had a long-standing infatuation with Miss Reed?" Dating back to childhood, Victor didn't flinch. "Margaret and I were friends as children. I respect her courage and integrity. If you're suggesting my testimony is motivated by romantic feelings, you're mistaken. And isn't it true that you've had a falling out with your father, that this entire performance is nothing more than a son's revenge against paternal discipline?" My father was preparing to disinherit me because I refused to participate in framing an innocent woman for murder," Victor replied evenly. "If seeking justice for that woman constitutes revenge, then yes, I suppose it is." The cross-examination continued, but Victor remained unshaken, his testimony consistent and compelling. When he was finally dismissed, Judge Daniels called for a brief recess before the next witness. During the break, Margaret found herself face-to-face with Augustus Blackwell in the courthouse corridor. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the young woman whose life he had tried to destroy, and the powerful man who had never contemplated failure. "You won't win," Augustus said quietly, his voice carrying none of the bluster she had expected, only a cold certainty. "The territorial court may be swayed by my son's theatrics, but higher courts will see things differently. I have friends in Washington, Miss Reed. Investments that matter to people who matter. This isn't over." "You're wrong, Mr. Blackwell," Margaret replied, finding courage in his threat. "It is over. It was over the moment you built your case on lies instead of truth. The moment you decided your ambition was worth more than justice." Something flickered in Augustus's eyes, not doubt precisely, but perhaps the first intimation that his carefully constructed world might be crumbling around him. Before he could respond, Harrison appeared at Margaret's side, gently guiding her back toward the courtroom. "Don't engage with him," he murmured. "The judge will make his ruling based on evidence, not confrontations in hallways." When court resumed, the atmosphere had grown even more charged. The prosecution called its key witness against Margaret, a ranch hand named Taylor, who claimed to have seen her arguing with Thomas Whitley in town days before the alleged murder. But as Taylor began his rehearsed testimony, the courtroom doors swung open, and Ezra Blackwell entered, arm in a sling, his face pale but determined. Behind him came Sheriff Calhoun and his daughter Emma, the latter clutching a leather-bound ledger to her chest. "Your Honor," Calhoun called, "I have evidence directly relevant to this witness's testimony." Judge Daniels frowned at the interruption but gestured for the sheriff to approach. After a brief, whispered conversation, the judge looked back to the witness stand. "Mr. Taylor," he said, his voice sharpened with new authority, "are you aware that perjury before this court is punishable by imprisonment?" Taylor's confidence visibly wavered. "I'm telling the truth, Your Honor." "Are you—" Ezra stepped forward, ignoring his father's venomous glare. "Tell me, Taylor, how much did my father pay you to lie about seeing Miss Reed with a man who never existed?" A hush fell over the courtroom. Taylor's eyes darted from Ezra to Augustus and back, panic rising in his expression. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. Emma Calhoun stepped forward, opening the ledger she carried. "This is Mr. Blackwell's payment record," she said quietly. "It shows 3 separate payments of $50 each to James Taylor on dates corresponding to his statements to the sheriff and preparation for this trial." "That's for legitimate work." Augustus rose to his feet, his composure finally cracking. "This is absurd, Your Honor. My own children conspiring with my enemies." "Mr. Blackwell," the judge interrupted sharply, "you will be seated and silent, or you will be removed from my courtroom." For several tense seconds, Augustus remained standing, his face contorted with barely controlled rage. Then slowly, he sank back into his chair. The remainder of the afternoon unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of revelations. Emma Calhoun testified about the absence of any legitimate record of Thomas Whitley in Blackwell business dealings. Sheriff Calhoun presented evidence that the body found on Reed property belonged to a drifter who had died in a bar fight miles away. And most damningly, Ezra Blackwell corroborated his brother's account of their father's elaborate frame-up, adding details only an insider could know. Through it all, Augustus Blackwell sat in rigid silence, watching as his carefully constructed empire of influence crumbled under the weight of truth. As the shadows lengthened outside the courtroom windows, Judge Daniels finally called an end to the testimony. He sat in contemplative silence for several long moments, reviewing the notes he had taken throughout the day. The courtroom held its collective breath. "In my 30 years on the bench," he began at last, "I have seen many troubling cases, but few have disturbed me as deeply as what I have witnessed today." His stern gaze settled on Augustus Blackwell. "The evidence presents a clear pattern of corruption, perjury, and abuse of influence aimed at perverting the course of justice for personal gain." He turned to Margaret. "Miss Reed, the charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. You are free to return to your property with the court's apologies for the ordeal you have suffered." Relief washed over Margaret in a dizzying wave. Harrison's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently in silent support. But the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Augustus Blackwell, you are hereby ordered to remain in this jurisdiction pending investigation of multiple charges of perjury, witness tampering, and fraud upon this court. Sheriff Calhoun, please take Mr. Blackwell into custody." A shocked murmur ran through the gallery as Calhoun moved to comply. Augustus rose slowly, his expression one of disbelief, quickly hardening into cold fury. "This isn't over." he repeated, his eyes finding Margaret across the courtroom. Not by a long measure. For now it is, Judge Daniels replied firmly. This court is adjourned. As Augustus was led away, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers townsfolk who had made the journey to support her. A Washington, who had slipped into the back of the courtroom partway through the proceedings, Sheriff Calhoun offering gruff congratulations. Through the crowd, she caught sight of Victor and Ezra standing together near the courtroom door, united for perhaps the first time in their adult lives by their stand against their father's corruption. As if sensing her gaze, Victor looked up, a small smile touching his lips. He offered a slight nod, not quite farewell, but something close to it before he and his brother slipped out into the gathering dusk. Later, as Margaret and Harrison rode away from the county seat beneath a canopy of stars, a weight seemed to have lifted from both their shoulders. "What will you do now?" Harrison asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "The ranch house is gone. Rebuilding won't be easy." Margaret considered the question, her hand finding the silver pocket watch in her pocket. "I'll rebuild," she said with quiet certainty. "The house, the barn, all of it. That land has been in our family for 2 generations. It will stay that way." "You know there's still coal and silver under your property," Harrison reminded her. "Once word gets out, you'll have mining companies lining up with offers." "Let them come," Margaret replied. "But the Reed land will be developed on Reed terms, with care for the earth-fair wages for workers and respect for what lies both above and below the ground." She glanced at her uncle, a smile touching her lips. "And I expect I'll need an experienced partner to help navigate those negotiations." Harrison's weathered face creased in an answering smile. "I suppose I could delay my return to Pennsylvania a while longer, family obligation and all that." The familiar weight of the silver watch pressed against Margaret's palm, a tangible connection to her father, to the land, to the legacy she had fought so hard to preserve. For the first time since Jonathan Reed's death, the frozen hands marking his final moment didn't feel like an ending, but rather a beginning, a point from which a new chapter could unfold. The road ahead would not be easy. Augustus Blackwell's threat still echoed in her mind, and she harbored no illusions that his influence and resentment had been fully neutralized. But for tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, Margaret Reed allowed herself to feel the quiet triumph of justice served and truth honored. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, it was enough to ride homeward with hope in her heart and family at her side. Spring came early to the Wyoming Territory that year, breathing new life into the land after a winter of uncharacteristic mildness. The Reed Ranch, once reduced to charred remains, and painful memories had risen anew from its ashes, a sturdy 2-story house gleaming with fresh paint, a barn larger and more solid than its predecessor fences mended, and fields prepared for planting. Margaret stood on the front porch watching as the first golden light of dawn crept across her land. 6 months had passed since the territorial court had cleared her name and sent Augustus Blackwell to await trial in the Cheyenne jail. 6 months of rebuilding, of healing, of forging a new path forward from the wreckage of the old. She wasn't alone in that journey. Harrison had stayed as promised, helping to oversee the reconstruction and lending his expertise to the complex negotiations now underway with the Westland Mining Company. Ruby Washington had joined them after the trial, declaring that her brother Isaiah could manage perfectly well on his own, and that Margaret needed a proper housekeeper if she intended to run both a ranch and a mining operation. The pocket watch rested on a small table beside Margaret's bed, now no longer carried constantly as a talisman of grief. Though she still glanced at its motionless hands each morning and evening, it had become less a reminder of what she had lost, and more a symbol of the legacy she carried forward. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road. A lone rider appeared, moving at an unhurried pace toward the ranch house. Even at a distance, Margaret recognized Victor Blackwell's straight-backed posture and distinctive bay gelding. She hadn't seen Victor since the trial. He and Ezra had left the territory shortly after their father's arrest, heading west to California, according to rumor. Their departure had felt right somehow, a clean break from the past, a chance for both brothers to build lives untainted by Augustus Blackwell's toxic influence. Yet here was Victor returning, just as the land itself was awakening to new possibilities. Margaret descended the porch steps as he dismounted in the yard. He looked different, more at ease in his own skin, his features relaxed, in a way she hadn't seen since they were children, meeting secretly at the creek between their properties. "Margaret," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Your home looks reborn." "It is," she agreed, studying his face. "As are you, it seems." A smile touched his lips. "Perhaps California agrees with me." He glanced around at the flourishing ranch. "As Wyoming clearly agrees with you despite everything." "This land is in my blood," Margaret said simply. "It always has been." She gestured toward the house. "Would you like some coffee? Ruby makes it strong enough to stand a spoon in." "I'd like that," Victor accepted, following her up the steps. Inside the house was filled with morning light streaming through large windows, an improvement over the small, dim rooms of the original structure. Harrison sat at the kitchen table, a spread of maps and documents before him. He looked up as they entered, surprise and wariness flickering across his face at the sight of Victor. "Blackwell," he acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts." "It's just Victor now," he replied. "I've left the Blackwell name behind, along with everything attached to it." Harrison's eyebrows rose, but he made no comment, merely gathering his papers to make room at the table. Over coffee strong enough to justify Ruby's reputation, Victor explained his return. "I've been following news of the territory from California. Father's trial is set for next month." "We've received summons to testify," Margaret confirmed. "All of us." Victor nodded, his expression sobering. "That's partly why I've come back. To stand with my testimony, see this through to the end." He hesitated, then added, "But also to make you an offer, Margaret." "An offer?" she repeated, wariness creeping into her voice. "Not that kind," Victor assured her hastily. "I'm well aware the Reed land will always be Reed land." He reached into his jacket, withdrawing a folded document. "This is the deed to the Blackwell Ranch. Ezra and I inherited it when Father was charged. His assets weren't seized, only his freedom. We've decided to sell it." Margaret stared at the document, understanding dawning. "You're offering me first right of purchase?" Victor nodded. "It borders your property to the north. The coal seam runs beneath both. Together, they'd make a formidable holding, enough to dictate terms to any mining operation for generations to come." He set the deed on the table. It seemed fitting, somehow. A way to close the circle. Harrison leaned forward, interest overcoming his initial skepticism. "What's your asking price?" "Fair market value," Victor replied. "Neither discount nor premium, just a clean, honest transaction between neighbors." A smile touched his lips. "Something I think both our fathers might have appreciated in another life." Margaret touched the deed, considering all it represented, not just land and resources, but a final resolution to the conflict that had consumed so many lives. "Where will you go after the trial?" she asked. "Back to California. Ezra and I have purchased a small shipping concern in San Francisco." Victor's expression lightened. It turns out we work well together when we're not competing for our father's approval. Who would have guessed? And Augustus? Harrison asked the question they had all been avoiding. Victor's face grew serious once more. The territorial prosecutor believes he'll serve at least 10 years. His connections in Washington have proven less reliable than he imagined once his methods became public knowledge. He looked directly at Margaret. He won't trouble you again. His day has passed. The conversation turned to practicalities, terms of sale boundaries, water rights. By the time Ruby served lunch, a tentative agreement had been sketched out to be formalized by attorneys in the coming weeks. As Victor prepared to depart later that afternoon, Margaret walked with him to where his horse waited. The spring sunshine cast long shadows across the yard, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of new growth and possibility. "I never thanked you properly," she said as he tightened the cinch on his saddle, "for standing against your father, for helping clear my name." Victor paused, his hands stilling on the leather straps. "You have nothing to thank me for, Margaret. If anything, I owe you an apology that can never be adequate for my part in what happened." "We can't change the past," Margaret replied, "only build something better from its remains." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw echoes of the boy who had taught her to fish, who had shared his dreams beside a creek on the border between their family's lands. "You always were the wisest of us," he said softly. The moment stretched between them, weighted with might-have-beens and roads not taken. Then Victor mounted his horse with a fluid motion, gathering the reins in practiced hands. "Until the trial, then," he said, settling into the saddle. "Until then," Margaret agreed, stepping back as he wheeled his mount toward the road. She watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the vast Wyoming landscape, until he disappeared over the distant rise. Only then did she turn back toward the house, toward Harrison, waiting on the porch with a questioning expression. "You all right?" he asked as she climbed the steps. "Yes," Margaret replied, surprised to find it was entirely true. "I think this chapter is finally closing." Harrison nodded, understanding Ipta's weathered features. "Your father would be proud of what you've built here." "What we've built," Margaret corrected gently. "Family sticks together, remember." A smile creased Harrison's face, warmth replacing the habitual gravity in his eyes. "That it does." That evening, after supper had been cleared away and Ruby had retired to her room, Margaret sat alone on the porch, watching as stars appeared one by one in the deepening blue of the Wyoming sky. The silver pocket watch rested in her palm, its weight familiar and comforting. On impulse, she opened the case, studying the motionless hands that had marked time's stopping at her father's death. Then, with deliberate care, she reached for the winding stem, turning it slowly until she felt the mechanism engage. The tiny click as the balance wheel began to move again seemed impossibly loud in the evening quiet. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of time resuming its flow of life, continuing beyond grief and loss. Of a legacy not ended, but transformed. Margaret Reed closed her fingers gently around the watch, feeling its renewed heartbeat against her palm. The land stretched before her, bathed in starlight, her father's land now truly her own. Not just acres to be defended, but a living trust to be nurtured. Not just soil and stone, but the very soul of all that had come before, and all that might yet be. And as the night deepened around the reborn Reed Ranch, that soul endured in the steady ticking of a silver watch in the quiet breeze across the Wyoming plains, in the unbroken line from father to daughter, to whatever future lay waiting beyond the horizon. Time moved forward once more, carrying with it the promise of healing, of growth, of life renewed from the ashes of the past. And Margaret Reed moved with it, finally free, to step beyond the shadow of grief into the light of what tomorrow might bring.